have Kim and Christopher today here to kick us off uh, this very exciting topic, blockchain-powered traceability, digital platforms, unlocking supply chain too. Before I introduce them, I'll just like to say that at the World Bank, we are now working on a food systems 2030 vision, which talks about healthy planets, healthy people, and healthy economies. Food system is going through stress for a long time, and COVID-19 has accentuated that stress with supply chain disruption. But we have likelihood of more obese people than people who have nutrition. Malnutrition and obesity both are increasing. We also have food system using more water than it's adding value environmentally, and you also have a lot of other issues about sustainability which have to do with ethics of how do we produce our crops, and does it really benefit the farmers or does it only benefit some intermediaries. So we are at threshold of a crisis, and this shows that we need more trust between the people in the supply chain, consumers, and the farmers. And one of the most promising solutions, which has been touted, I will say touted because it's still not proven, and there is a lot of hype around that, is blockchain. And we are very curious in the World Bank that if someone is trying to find a solution to really build this trust and really develop traceability. Traceability is a very big issue. And it's a question of whether these enterprises are sustainable, these enterprises are ethical, and whether they are socially responsible. So when we organized another session at the Plug and Play some time back, and Kim made a pitch on coffee, then we thought it's a very interesting example, which clearly is talking about a point solution on a commodity or something, which really allows traceability to be looked at very differently, but from the perspective of enterprises, consumers, and all together. So without further ado, I would like now to introduce Kim Rath, and who's has an interesting background. She has worked with NGOs in many countries, and then she came to Rice to do degrees in economics and statistics, and there she worked with Chris Jorgen, who's the chief architect of Topi, and he also is from Rice, and so this is a kind of a Rice incubated startup, but I think it's no longer a startup. It's really becoming more bigger than just a startup. So I think they are very interesting. They come together and bring the social impact space and the blockchain space together. And it's my pleasure to introduce Kim Rath and Christopher Jorgen. Over to you, Kim, and please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you, Parmesh. It's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for having us here. I definitely think we're still a startup, and I think a lot of startups stay startups forever. So it's definitely a great pleasure to be here. We are very excited. I even see one of our professors that actually runs the Center for Computational Finance Economic Systems in the participant list. And that's actually where Chris and I originally met each other at Rice University. So we're very excited to have some of them here. I am going to start us off with just an agenda here. So what we wanted to do is really go through the motivations behind, blockchain itself, like why was the technology originally designed and what was it designed to accomplish? Some of the basic value propositions of blockchain technology as it stands. Chris is going to go through these for us: decentralization, transparency, immutability, these words that are constantly being thrown out in the blockchain sphere, and how that actually applies to the traceability, especially in agri-food and especially in supply chains, and how can we then we will go into detail, and I'll transition in here again, where I'll talk about what we did at Topol and the approach we took which is a little bit different than building a traceability platform. We actually built a blockchain from scratch, a purpose-built blockchain that is primarily focused on sustainable and ethical, like people being able to prove that businesses can make their sustainable and ethical claims. But we'll go into like very nitty-gritty details and actually show you an example of a platform that is powered by the Topol blockchain. And so as we go through these steps for explaining Topol, we'll do a few, examples of that, and then we'll move from there. We'll start, I'll actually take us to a live dashboard of one of the platforms that uses Topol's blockchain, and show you how all the details that Chris will run through from a decentralization, transparency, and immutability perspective, like how that plays in real life and what that means and what that looks like through that dashboard. So we're excited to be here, and I will have Chris kick us off on the next slide.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kim.
1 minute, Chris, just before you get started, just to let everyone know that you could type your questions in the chat as questions are while the presentations are going on. There's a different format. We don't go for questions at the end. You can keep on asking questions while the presentations are going on, and then we will be able to incorporate all your questions in a much more efficient way. So I would encourage everyone in the audience to type your question in the chat box, and we will take all your questions at the end of the presentations. I also want to introduce my colleague G.I. Kim, who is agriculture economist at the World Bank, and she leads our programs in Africa and digital agriculture and tech programs in Africa. And she will be a discussant after Kim and Chris finish their presentation. Over to you, Chris. Sorry to disturb you. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much. All right. So good morning, everyone. And so as Kim said, where I'm going to be starting today really is first on the motivations underlying the problem that blockchain is built to solve, and then looking at kind of its three core properties that allow it to solve this problem and to actually be applicable to the space that Kim, I, and the rest of the Topol team are now working in. So in 2007 and 2008, the Bitcoin blockchain, which was the first blockchain, was first published as just a paper and then launched as a kind of a real software experiment to solve what was known as the double spending problem. If we think back to that time, this is when the world was going through kind of its last economic crisis in terms of debt, in terms of what that was doing to markets, in terms of kind of how all that compounded and how much that eroded people's trust in the financial system. And so what a single developer or a group of developers using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto came up with was a decentralized way, without any central authority, without any central gatekeeper, a decentralized way of solving what's known as the double spending problem. And the double spending problem, put very simply, is this issue that anything digital has in terms of, if I have one copy of, let's say, a song, like an MP3 file or any sort of digital record, it's very easy for me to just copy that and send that around. And while that, might be only a little bit of a problem for something like a song, it becomes kind of a catastrophic problem for anything resembling money or anything resembling a digital asset, like a digital twin of coffee, a digital twin of a diamond. Well, because in the real world, if I only have $10, if I only have a single sack of coffee or one diamond, I really shouldn't be able to send that around as if I have 100 different copies of it, because they'll be false. The issue had always been, though, the only way to ever prevent this sort of behavior was through a central repository that would filter, kind of, and receive and record all transactions from a sender before they would ever go to a recipient. And there was no way to ever do this without trusting, without identifying and then trusting a central authority to keep all these records straight and to keep everyone honest. So the brilliance of kind of the original blockchain innovation was it was a way to democratize trust. It was a way that a group of people, without any prior knowledge of each other, without any prior reason to even trust each other, where those people could come together and actually not trust each other, but trust the outcomes that they were actually presented with. So if we take just the simplest example of the Bitcoin blockchain, and I say I have some Bitcoin. I have one Bitcoin, and we'll say a Bitcoin is worth $100 today, or whatever it may be. Without blockchain technology, I could send it to John and I could send it to Katie, and both of them wouldn't know until it was too late that one of them had been fooled. And blockchain technology, again, allows us to make sure that I can only send it to John, and if I send it to John, that actually prevents me from sending it to anyone else, all without any single source of central authority. So that's a little bit on the double spending problem. That was the genesis of everything in the blockchain space. So Kim, if we can go to the next slide, we can look at how this kind of initial problem decision led to the three kind of primary value propositions of blockchain technology. The first one being decentralization, second one being transparency, and the third one being immutability. So if we can go over to nice, helpful next slide for kind of an image of what decentralization looks like. So decentralization is probably the simplest of these three value propositions to understand and to visualize. And really, it should be no surprise from kind of the genesis of blockchain technology, which is how do we solve the double spending problem? How do we prevent this sort of fraud from happening without any central authority? So if we look on the left, we have a centralized system where we do have this kind of central node. And if I'm trying to send something from the top right corner to the bottom left corner, I always have to go through that central node. If I'm sending something from the top right corner to the top left corner, once again, I have to go through that central node. So if that central node is compromised in any way, if it is tampered with, if it simply fails for some reason, the entire system fails with it. But if we go over all the way to the right side to a what's known as a distributed network, one that is more decentralized, we can see that if any single kind of point in that group actually disappears or fails, that node is out, that participant is no longer active, or that participant may no longer be honest, but all of the other actors still remain connected to each other. All other actors still retain the ability to send value, to send information to and from each other. So we've kind of removed this singular vulnerability, this potential single point of failure. So that's on decentralization, and this is how blockchain networks are always constructed. They're constructed kind of with this decentralized topology to them, this decentralized spread of how participants interact with each other. So if we can go next, we will encounter transparency. So obviously this issue of transparency is kind of central when we talk about what blockchain technology has to offer for things like supply chains. And kind of each of these three value propositions is very much built one on top of the other. Because blockchain technology is intended to be decentralized, what we also get with that is that the information that's on the blockchain on the blockchain network can be decentralized as well. But a very important consideration, or a very important caveat to that, is blockchains don't store information directly. Instead, blockchains store proof of information. And that's actually what we're looking at here. And Kim will dive a little bit further into this application later on. But what we're looking at is a coffee supply chain traceability application that's built on the top of blockchain. And it's actually this transaction hash here in the middle that represents all of the data of a given transaction, of this given transaction. But this transaction hash is only meaningful, or only becomes more meaningful, if I actually have the data that comprises that transaction. I can take that data myself, me as any participant, I can take that data and I can run it through a very, very simple kind of little math equation that can be run in your computer browser. I can see that my data that I've been given matches what was originally put on the blockchain. They'll have the exact same output. This very long string right here, they will always match if the data is the same. And so when blockchains talk about transparency, this is actually what we mean. We mean that the proof or that verification is decentralized and accessible to all parties in the system. So we can satisfy the need for transparency without actually kind of giving away trade secrets, without making blockchains this thing that forces companies to be anti-competitive and therefore kind of blocking the ability of the technology to actually be adopted. So this is kind of a very, very important point that people maybe who get scared of blockchain, especially in the enterprise space, say, oh, no, I don't want all of my data public. Blockchains are very transparent. Well, wonderfully, they're transparent in their proof, in their verification ability, but they don't necessarily need to be transparent in their data as well. They can be set up that way, but they don't actually have to be. So we have this kind of tuning ability to allow blockchain technology to be suitable across a wider range of use cases. So if we can go on to the last one now, Kim. Now we're going to be looking at immutability. This is kind of always my favorite one to explain because it's I view it as what's most closely linked to the actual name of a blockchain itself. And so this idea of immutability or tamper-proofness means, simply put, that if once a record is actually on the blockchain, it cannot be changed ever. So we go back in history, we know that history has never been tampered with once it's on the blockchain. So again, this immutability, this inability for data to be tampered with. And the way this works, quite simply, is because blockchain networks are made up of blocks that are chained together. And so what I mean by this is, if we look at this central block, this central kind of set of transactions, Alice pays Bob, Chris pays Doris, Ed pays Fred. This is a set of transactions that's grouped together into a block. And then what happens is we actually sum all of this up and we turn it into a fingerprint, just kind of a little snippet of data, and we attach that, or we kind of add that fingerprint to the next set of transactions. And then with the next set of transactions, we do the same thing, and we do another fingerprint. And so we always have fingerprints of previous data. So the previous data in a very, very compressed form always ends up in the present. And that's kind of the way this immutability works. So then if we consider this kind of with the coffee example, the verification again kind of works two ways. Is once we have the data, once we have these kind of coffee, if we reimagine these as coffee related transactions, every single part later on in the supply chain, every set of actors later on in the supply chain can see and can trust that the data input by the farmer or the first trader or the second trader is exactly what was originally added in. But for kind of more things on the coffee details, I will absolutely defer to Kim and let her address that later on. So Kim, with this, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Unmute myself here. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
So yeah, so one of the things that, and I'm going to go through an example exactly and actually take you to one of the dashboards that tracks coffee from source to sale. But one of the things that we at Topol had realized when Chris, James, and I, the original three co-founders, James is our CTO and runs everything from a tech perspective. When we first got together in 2014, 2015, one of the biggest questions that came up during that time was there was a lot of greenwashing going on. There were a lot of people saying things like chocolate free of child labor, carbon neutral business practices, sustainable farm to table meat and veggies, and diamonds mined without human or environmental costs. Now, I'm South African and I am actually from a diamond family. So all these ethical and sustainable commitments are very nice to hear, but they mean absolutely nothing without proving everything and having a tamper-proof changelog from source to sale to be able to validate everything that's happening. So what we've seen is exactly that, and organizations are facing now mounting pressures to increasingly prove sustainable and positive impact, and not just claim these things. But unfortunately, the current methods we have, the current certification methods we have, are very time consuming and very expensive. And a lot of you on this call probably clearly understand that part of it. And it takes a lot of time, and it costs months and hundreds of thousands of dollars. There is a lack of means of transparency and verifiable proof, exactly what Chris was showing right now. There is no way to actually do that where you actually know in real time that there is a tamper-proof changelog recording the information, what the farmer said, what the actual brand said, and what the consumer knows from that chain. There is a lot of gaps that allow for data loss and manipulation. And then what we had seen at Topol is that instead of building a single software or a single solution, we had really seen what is necessary. Like any emerging market, we see this sustainable and ethical claims market as an emerging market that needed a digital infrastructure. It needed a highway system. It needed a way to actually have things tracked from source to sale. And so the existing technology deficits that existed was the idea that there was a lot of data monopolization. So like if you can keep a centralized source of data, then when the farmer does input information, you could go edit that information and make sure that information is favorable towards the brand so that the consumer has no problem with it. You can have a lot of issues with data handoffs. There's a lot of institutional voids that exist in these systems. So how do we get this so that it's as simple as possible as utilizing a flip phone for someone to be able to record and be a part of the recording of this data? At the same time, these claims need to be verified. So how do we make sure that even the source can verify these claims? And then ultimately, a lot of people have a lack of trustworthiness in certification bodies because they ultimately get paid by the end party. And so what we've done is this is actually the exact process for the UT certification body, or for the UT certification stamp. And the current certification standards, such as UT, have this complex pricing setup composed of program fees up front, then these site audit certifications, which is what happens here, these fees that happen at the source here, where you pay the certification body to do the site audits, and then the chain of custody audits, which is the further fees, and this is where the data gets recorded here, is that you have data uploads that are happening in real time. And we've had a lot of our people telling us how extremely complex it is to upload the data, even to get the UT certification to be part of the UT network. And again, these systems are not real time. They're extremely convoluted and inefficient, and it makes it impossible for these businesses to actually predict their costs. And so what we've been able to say is really go through this is there's a potential applicability and value to the supply chain certification process using this transparency and security to bootstrap trust. So putting increased transparency and security into the certification process can increase the trust among supply chain actors. And I'll give you an example of that right now. The combining histories with fungibility or interchangeability. So since assets traced on a blockchain, as you start tracing these assets on a blockchain, can be linked to their entire histories. So you can link it all the way back to the farmer. We can use this immutable link and the characteristics of this origin and its full life cycle without introducing or undermining the interchangeability of what's going on. I will show an example of that too. And then we can do simplified scalability for multiple certifiers. So a lot of these processes, you might have, one certification body that you pay, but you are making a bunch of other certifications or other claims that you would like to record. So given the decentralized nature of the technology, scaling a blockchain-powered standard to multiple certifiers, or even actually thinking about defensible self-certification that allows you to make specific claims is extremely important. So ultimately, transparency, immutability, decentralization. And so how do we think through this? So instead of having numerous individual transactions, our blockchain, the Topol blockchain, streamlines the exchange of data on funds, good, and certification claims all into one transaction. So as Chris showed you there, you collect all that information into one transaction, and it is recorded with a fingerprint, a hash. And this also allows for even the farmers to have self-certifying when they say they have organic good that are actually defensible, enabling supply chain actors to reliably validate themselves and avoid unnecessary time and expense. So this is where I actually want to switch us to a SaaS-powered platform. One of the actual users of the Topo blockchain is called Fair Food. So Fair Food is a living wage farming certification organization that built a SaaS platform called Traced using Topos blockchain. So what that means is that this is an example of Traboca coffee. So I'm going to use my analogy again of the highway system. So we are the underlying highway system, and they, or let's say grid of high-speed rails, and they built a central station, a station on top of these rails that now has a bunch of different, brands, different, in this case, coffee brand, Traboca Coffee, using that central station to validate living wage farming certification. So in this case, what happens here is that there is specific, here we have about 278 farmers that have been recording transactions about their specific coffee that they're delivering. So when Germa actually delivers coffee to the washing station itself, the outgrower to the washing station, what happens is there's a transaction. The coffee cherry is outgoing to the washing station. There is information recorded with it, the amount that's delivered, and the time and day that it was delivered. And what you had previously seen was this blockchain transaction, right? So you had the coffee cherry, the specific kilogram of good, the date, the seller's name, the actual buyer's name, and their unique fingerprints. Now, this is where it becomes extremely interesting. So this unique hash was what was recorded on the Topo blockchain. So what I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to the Topo Block Explorer. And so what this is the actual search engine where you can go find the exact block and the exact transaction. That transaction, I'm just going to go back so you can see. Let's just look at the last 5 letters, 5SM8Q. You can see that unique transaction that is recorded in the specific block where it was recorded on chain with its information. And what you can see here is the sender and the recipient and how much. So exactly that, you see the sender, the actual seller, the recipient, and the kilograms that moved between those parties. Now, if the data were to be tampered with here, if the next step here, which is actually the next step here, is from the washing station to the dry mill, so there's another block of transactions that happen here, right? So there's transactions between the parchment. So now it went from the actual coffee cherries came in from these different farmers. And these transactions have these extra pieces of information that are now linked to them. In this case was this farmer really paid this amount of money? Right, and so here there is this additional evidence of the exact transactions that these farmers were paid, and this information is stored again with a unique hash, right? And so when that information is stored with a unique hash, when you tamper with any of this information, think about it as a little zip folder, and you zip that folder and you create a little fingerprint on that folder. When any of the data that you had previously entered gets manipulated, this fingerprint, the fingerprint that was created no longer matches the original fingerprint, which is recorded on chain in the Topo blockchain. And so what allows to happen here is as you move from source to sale, there is all these different types of transactions, all this different type of information that's being recorded. Now, the coffee example that we even talk about in the video that I know was sent around that I had mentioned, the vision we have for 2030 is very much the next step. So how do we go here and make sure that the farmer themselves can, via their own flip phone, validate that what would happen is the washing station sends an alert to the Fair Food system saying that today, that farmer number 1, I don't want to use specific names, but let's choose a name here, be it Germa, he had sent this much kilogram. This is the information that's recorded in the actual station. and it's recorded on chain, and then Germa gets a text message for him to validate that he was paid the price that is claimed here. Now, how do you do that when we are told constantly that blockchains, and this is kind of the next move, that blockchains are extremely energy intensive, that there's no way that you're going to be able to access a blockchain with a flip phone. Those are the types of things that really became an issue because you need a full-on digital infrastructure to think about these different things. You cannot just build a single-use platform, but you have to think about a digital infrastructure. Now, the next step is even, as Parmesh had actually mentioned in the beginning, is coronavirus is a wake-up call to supply chain management right now. We're seeing coronavirus crisis show that visibility into supply chain is critical. But then the other information here that we had talked about earlier is the most discussed solution we're seeing right now is this increased transparency, diversification, and tamper-proof digitization, that real-time tamper-proof changelog. That information becomes extremely valuable in creating financing mechanisms because these farmers are unbanked. They have no access to institutions where they have credit worthiness, but this credit history, and because it's immutable, it's credit history that is recorded and stays with them indefinitely, can now be used to build alternative credit scores. One of the solutions that's currently being built on the top of blockchain is literally a mobile wallet partnering with a supply chain solution and actually thinking about how do you use that supply chain information as a microfinancing institute to give loans to these farmers. So really pairing up that idea. But the ultimate thing that this is very important is that there are so many different blockchain powered traceability platforms that are coming alive now, but the number of actual blockchains, the actual blockchain protocol, the actual underlying mechanisms, the actual, the ledgers themselves, the consensus, the mechanisms by which these ledgers operate are really small. And then at the same time, the number of groups building blockchains for target markets or building it for a specific purpose or a unified problem in this place is really close to zero. So what I meant by that is, so what makes this different? So when you look at any blockchain, you have to look at we call it a little triangle. You look at security, scalability, and accessibility. And so when you're trying to think about building a platform or building some SaaS application or an application or anything on top of blockchain technology to use that proof mechanism, the proof mechanism underneath, what you need to think about are these three things. Okay, so how secure is that blockchain? How good is it at actually not like locking someone out? Right? Is it something that, in the same time, from a security perspective, where is its energy intensity? So proof of work is highly energy intensive. Proof of stake is actually three orders of magnitude less energy intensive than proof of work. And to the thing that what we've done in the top of blockchain, we've implemented Ouroboros, which is the first provably secure proof of stake algorithm that is also way more energy efficient and not energy intensive. It's actually 3 times to be exact. And then at the same time, we have to think about scalability in the sense of how many transactions need to be moving via this grid of rails, right? How many things need to be exchanged via this grid of rails in real time. And so a lot of the general purpose blockchains that are being built have to think about, they have to build for more general purpose. So high frequency trading needs to happen in the same place as supply chain tracking needs to happen. But high frequency trading, all you need is the ability to, track balances. But you really do need the ability here to really trace assets rather than track balances. So that's another piece of this, is how do you set that up, and then at the same time, how do you make sure that you could still do thousands of transactions per second and not give up on that scalability piece? And then the last piece, which I really think is the necessity to really get peer-to-peer, I mean producer to consumer access to each other, is lightweight accessibility. What that means is the blockchain protocol itself, the actual validation, the actual talking to that chain, you need to be able to access just your set of transactions, and you need to be able to access it from something as simple as a flip phone. So the beauty of the top of blockchain is we actually have been able to run it on something as simple as a Raspberry Pi. And so really thinking about how do we make sure that the producer can participate in this data entry, and the validation of these claims all the way to the consumer on the other side. But at the same time, how do we build a blockchain that is secure and scalable, that can be taken into this next level of intensity of saying, okay, how do we make sure that we don't cut people out and monopolize their data against them? And so that's ultimately where we are. And so the Topple blockchain was built with this unique purpose to help businesses, ultimately businesses, organizations, certification bodies, prove and ultimately monetize their ethical and sustainable practices and use these things to positively impact their environments. But at the same time, we always say, we wanted to build digital infrastructure so that you can change the world and we can just help you prove that. And so with that, I kind of want to open it up for questions, because there's going to be a lot of questions, and Chris and I love questions. So we've been in this space for a while. Actually, the blockchain space is, 2007, as Chris mentioned, 8, 9. Chris has been in the space in 13, my other co-founder too. I've been in the space in 2015. We've been doing a lot of different educational talks. We actually teach the blockchain courses at Rice University. We really do care about people truly understanding the uses of blockchain and when to use it and when not to use it. And we believe in our purpose-built blockchain, but we would love to have more questions. And so I am going to stop sharing my screen here so that you guys can see me and Chris's face, and I'll open the chat as well.
Thanks a lot, Kim and Chris, and for keeping in time. I think you guys are used to pitching it in time, and really, so I think traditionally when we have people coming in webinars, they take 5 minutes more. You have finished 5 minutes earlier, which is very good, but will allow us to have questions. The format we follow here is that we have Gi Kim as a discussant, and she will first raise some issues in order to set the tone of the discussions. And then we have been receiving a lot of good questions from the chat. And if you can go to the chat and start looking at questions, because I'll paraphrase them, and you get some time to look at the questions and respond while Gi is talking, and then incorporate Gi's questions as well. And then you can give an integrated response, whichever way you want to. Over to you, Gi. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Parmesh. And thank you, Kim and Chris, for this wonderful presentation. I think I have always been very fascinated by blockchain. I've read actually the first, I would say, white paper, and then was mesmerized by, the innovation and transformation that it really brings to all the pain points of industry asset management, right? So giving the transparency, immutability, temp-proof, and decentralizing the, really the centralized sort of a trust system, or the gatekeeping of all this traditional financial system as well. So I think it's really incumbent of us to understand better first the technology, and then how to utilize and also minimize also the negativities that are associated with the blockchain technology. Key of which is the energy consumption, right? To be able to, mine the code, and then also sometimes the tokens or currencies that are related to the blockchain. So yes, it was really eye-opening, and then very, very useful actually seeing your partnership with, I don't know, it's called partnership or the use case, right, of the coffee farmer. And that was really, that really gave us a lot of, I guess, food for thoughts to further engage with you to some of the actual projects and verification process that we can build in some of the transactions that that our project, World Bank Finance Development Project in the agriculture sector. So my key takeaways is really this is a very good confirmation of a lot of pain points in the asset management industry, and also satisfying the transparency without really revealing too much of the trade secret, which I think in the industry a lot of times is the lost sort of a resistance as well, right? And that's, I think, where the beauty of blockchain really comes from. And the fact that the properties of each block referring to the precedent block, which really gives the term blockchain. It's also very it gives the properties of immutability, and that's something in the business of certification and then involving a lot of different stakeholders and parties. I think that's the value that's really priceless, right? And also demonstrating that the code, the hash code, I'm sure in the back end of the blockchain technology, that code is also represented so much more graphically, the hash code and all this timestamp. But it was good to see how, as the end user, we can have a traceability by just searching in the history. So that was very useful. My question would be, so that was like my key takeaways, and it was really great to have this confirmation and see the real example. But there's one question that every time I see all these wonderful and exciting demonstration, I still cannot grasp very well the one-to-one match of physical assets and then the digital asset, right? As far as we can always, key in all this information that are representing the physical asset in a data format. But however, that exact physical asset matching the digital asset or digital twin all the way throughout the supply chain, how do we actually 100% guarantee that one-to-one match without sort of an IoT intervention or a QR code? So for example, this case of farmer Germa and his fruits, right, coffee fruits, and it gets sort of accumulated in along the supply chain. Of course, I'm not asking each pod or each pod of cocoa or each bean of coffee, but still there is sort of a temperability or a room for sort of corruption or really the temp. So how do we in also in the infrastructural environment where connectivity is an issue or power is an issue, what are the sort of the least energy consuming technology options of further ensuring that match of the physical asset and then the data asset? And then I wanted to also ask your opinion about the issue of the trust, right? Because among the farmer groups and also in the agricultural sector, industry-wide, I think the issue of the trust as the social capital is really big. And farmers at times, even when they are offered better price from, let's say, the first stockist that he's never met, right? He would actually choose to suffer lower price because of the trust that has been actually built with a familiar face stockist, right? And in this case, it really needs convincing farmers of changing the behavior of trusting in the blockchain where his payment comes, I would say faster and in a more transparent way. However, trusting in that itself, I think it's the social capital that needs building. So my question to you is, in your use case with the trace trade, how that sort of engaging in farmers and training and even the change in the behavior, how did it come about? And my third question is this, coming out of that single sort of point failure problem of centralized trust system or centralized certification process, to decentralization of the blockchain. If I understand correctly, the technology, it is the majority consensus, not unanimous consensus of the nodes in the blockchain. So is this, and I know the speed that we are talking is, I guess, not as fast as light speed, but the consensus that's made really in a blink of an eye. However, that majority consensus, is that still something that in the industry, which is prone to a lot of sort of economic, whim of powerful economic actors, is that something to be concerned about? And then do you see a potential in the blockchain technology where that sort of rule of the consensus changing? Or is that something that can also be customized depending on the industry?
Okay, so that's the three questions.
Kim, just wait.
Yeah. Oh, Parmesh, you muted again.
So I think you take these questions along with the other questions which are coming. There are clarification questions you should take first before diving into GI's questions, because GI's questions are very specific. Okay. So I will moderate the discussion. And I will tell you which questions to answer first, which questions to answer next, so that you are not, because you will lose most of the people if you go this way, basically. So I think let me modulate that discussion. So can you answer some very specific questions on the technology itself? So people are saying, if the first data entry is not correct, then will that piece of information, if it's not correct, continue to, not give you any credibility about the whole blockchain? And the same thing other people are asking is that how can we sure that the data initially received on blockchain is not corrupted? So I think this is a very important question people are asking, because they want to comprehend.
Yeah.
How do you do that? So can you answer that question before I go to the next set of questions?
Yeah, Chris, do you want to take that? Is something that Chris spends a lot of time in the field with people, but yeah, definitely go for it.
Absolutely. So we're looking at kind of two issues here. One is, how do we make sure good data comes in, and how do we make sure once data is in, it's not later corrupted? So on the data entry side, one thing I do want to clarify first is that just because we can never delete information from a blockchain doesn't mean that if I have some incorrect information that does somehow end up in, I can still put in the corrected information. I can say the incorrect information, I can mark that as wrong. It's still there, so we still see it, kind of like with a line through it, but then we've added in the correct information as well. So that's just a little point of clarity. But really the way that this is prevented, and this is intended to be prevented, is actually through the decentralization aspect of blockchain technology. So what we can start doing is, instead of just saying, oh, we're going to ask a single point, kind of a single actor, what their information is, we can basically poll entire groups. We can say we're going to get information from the seller and from the buyer. And it's kind of only where that information overlaps, because those are counter-aligned parties. So if we get confirmation from one side of a transaction and the other, we have a much higher level of kind of trust or of guarantee for that information. But then the last and kind of most important consideration is blockchains can move funds as well. So it's very, very easy to just upload false information. What's much more difficult to pull off is entirely fake transactions where goods are claimed to be moving, and that's just a claim because, as was pointed out, they're still digital. But if we can move real value in the opposite direction, as we can with blockchains, that makes it incredibly more complex to actually pull off kind of a type of fraud like this. But then on the side of how do we make sure data isn't corrupted later on, that's kind of the much easier problem for blockchains to solve. And I can say it absolutely cannot be corrupted, but there's a lot of fairly complex math involved there that we probably shouldn't be getting into right now. But that's kind of the two sides of that issue.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And so can you also answer the clarification question which GI raised about how do you match the physical and the digital together? That's a clarification question according to you. And then I will go to the specific questions, because people who have experienced blockchain already have not seen that working. And there are very specific questions. These are practitioners on the ground, our teams. So I will raise those questions, the tough ones, and the end. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of how we match is really dependent on the supply chain. And this is why Kim always tries to focus us in her explanation as kind of this enabling technology rather than just kind of this very high level like web solution. And the reason for that is because it really does depend. So for instance, in the case of when we're moving diamonds or when we're moving precious gems, we can have kind of lasered in IDs, and we can link that lasered ID every step of the way along the chain. And that's kind of a much easier problem to solve when we're dealing with non-fungible assets, kind of very, very high value, and we say we want this singular asset to be moved all the way. It becomes much more difficult when we're dealing with batches. So, coffee is a brilliant example of this, where we're going into buckets, we're going into bags, and we're kind of moving and transforming along the way. And so where blockchain really focuses here is it kind of works in, I'm going to say, a mass balance setup. And it's not necessarily just about saying, oh, we're going to perfectly tie through IoT and things like that, a singular asset to a digital asset, though we can use IoT. It's just a question is sometimes IoT might be a bit expensive. What blockchain more focuses on is removing the economic incentive for people to lie and removing the economic incentive for fraud to actually happen. So as long as we know how much coffee or how much of any commodity went in on the input side, we can lock and we can prevent more coming out on the output side. And we can even build in loss ratios. We can build in kind of all of our transformation ratios into that. So if we don't have any certification, if we don't have any audit processes, if you took all of those out, as I wouldn't recommend doing, but if you were to even take all of those out, the worst thing that someone could do with blockchain is just take all of their certified coffee, take it out, throw it away, replace that with non-certified coffee, but then all they've done is they've had to bring in new coffee, and they don't get to sell the old coffee as certified anymore because now it's kind of gone. It's outside of the chain, and they can move that forward in time or forward in the chain. But there becomes zero economic incentive for that to happen, and there still then becomes a risk in actually behaving like that. But again, that's only in the realm where we don't have any audit processes, any certification, no third-party checking, and because all these things are still meant to kind of be layered in. They're meant to be layered in more cost-effective ways. They're meant to be layered in more efficient or effective ways. But this is still something that does need to be considered. I think Kim has something to add on that. She's seen a lot of things on the ground as well. So I'll let Kim add to that.
Yeah, I think that there is the, being a statistician too, right? Like the one thing about blockchains that are beneficial is multi-data entry points, right? So exactly what Chris was saying, it's not just about having the adversarial design where you have, the opposite sides that are essentially creating a Nash equilibrium that both of them, if they lie, the answer won't be there. But it is really trying to think about the economic actors in the sense of, if you could have multiple data and entry points and information gathered at that point of validation. So it could be a certification process. It could be a claim made by the specific farmer at that point in time. It could be other data. So like we've seen people now talk to us about some of the drone footage that they're using to think through these farms and think through like, okay, well, this farm cannot produce more than X kilograms of coffee, and so there's no way that they could be reporting this much on this specific farm. So those are the types of things that when we say like coffee by 2030 versus coffee now, right, there's the beauty of having multi-data entry points and having all those data entry points as the validation, as part of the validation, bolsters that claim, right, starts helping that claim. But it's about making sure that those data entry points are actually also real time and are actually stuff that, you know, you don't have to go record data. Because if we go back to like the current methods of the certification process or the current methods of what's being validated, none of them are real time. So the low-hanging fruit here is to create just a continuous process, right? Just something that you don't have a certifier going to these remote areas every 3 years, making this validation and saying, okay, we now tested 5 out of the 50 farmers, great. We are absolutely now, you know, this whole farming cooperative is organically certified. So it's about really creating a tamper-proof change log, as I always say, like that's real time. And so being able to create a continual effect, and what I mean by that is also allowing for a repeated gain. So I know I'm always going to bring economics into this because that's where my background lies, but the ultimate thing is you talked about the other side of this, the trust in the farmer. The farmers have trust in being part of these cooperatives, right? And so the reality is there's other ways in which you can use blockchain technology to really think about those cooperative environments and say, okay, well, the reality is you get to have your own personal repeated history. And so if your cooperative has some actor that is actually over-reporting constantly, because this is a repeated game and it's not just a one-time recording, and these characteristics can be identified later, because now point Z can point back to point C, where usually point Z can only point back to Y or X, right? And so there's no way for them to be able to go back and see exactly where the change happened in the change log. And so now the farmers get an opportunity to actually act as like bounty hunters, where they could actually self-report who is over, you know, delivering, who's under, because the repeated game hurts them. If they're not all participating in this game in a fair manner, they won't get their pay and people will move to different cooperatives. So in a way, this is actually beneficial for cooperatives more than anything else, for this, you know, trust environment that actually happens. And a cooperative is a great place to start with blockchain implementations, because cooperatives also want to start, you know, in that setting. These farmers might want to own their own washing stations, right? They might want to actually take economic control of those areas that they are in. And the way in which you can do that, and that's in the little video that I made for the presentation we did earlier on the coffee, is the ultimate thing is because, you know, you have this highway system where, you know, you're tracking this digital twin of a good in one direction, and to validate the accuracy of the information, you're actually having the funds move in the opposite direction. The beauty of blockchains too is that you can keep some money back at the washing station that's aggregated, and you can send the rest to their mobile wallets. And so that means that they are actually able to start pooling and start participating in their own like economic bank, right? So there's certain things that you can start doing using the underlying technology. And I know these are, you know, when people hear these things, it's extremely futuristic, right? But the reality is that if you're implementing the right platforms at the beginning, I actually say if you're implementing the right digital infrastructure, like you would do in any emerging market, before you go implement software. So instead of just having the farmers have mobile wallets and now there's a supply chain tracking system, how do these two things talk to each other? And thinking through like a digital infrastructure that actually has these things talking to each other from the beginning, or actually setting up a mobile wallet and a platform that are actually linked from the beginning, is, and at the same time integrated using blockchain technology. So you could actually have, you know, for instance, in our situation, we have Katina, which works with Paycode in Zambia. They literally just integrate into Topol's blockchain the same way that the supply chain platform would integrate into Topol's platform. So it would be just a talking to the underlying rail system. So having a united highway system so that these ecosystems don't operate in their own little, you know, cities. Right, and so actually having a highway system that connects these two digital ecosystems that are starting to create, and I feel like that's actually, and I know there were a bunch of others, but like in Africa especially, and I'm coming from South Africa, this is what I've seen. There's a lot of digital innovation. There's a lot of leapfrogging going on, and if we actually think through this from the beginning, where we're saying, but how do we connect this mobile payments, which everyone's leapfrogged into mobile payments, into my supply chain tracking mechanism from the beginning, it becomes a whole different ecosystem at the end. And I think that's very much like going into the nitty-gritty deep details of this, but I think
I'll have to stop you there because your question was, reply was very long and we have a lot of questions waiting in the wings. So I would now read out 4 questions. Please note them down and respond to them in a crisp manner now. Otherwise, we'll never be able to take all the questions and people are waiting in the queue. Not good to have frustrated people see their questions not answered. Okay. So the first question which comes from Sitaram Chandra, who leads a lot of our operations in China, says blockchain solutions have been around almost 5 years in highly integrated value chains, yet the progress has been limited. Obviously, the constraints are less on technology side, but more on behaviors of producers, intermediaries, and lead firms. What kind of behaviors will drive greater adoption of blockchain technology? So don't answer one by one. Please note these questions and then answer them in a cluster. Okay. Otherwise, if you take one by one, we'll be here and no one will be left to listen to you. Okay. Next. I think the second set of questions is that what are the added costs to the farmers and others in the supply chain to implement? And that has to do with, have you seen premium prices for farmers, processor exporters that are selling coffee with blockchain, without blockchain, with blockchain? Are there any added returns coming to the farmer and how will they come? Then the questions are also about from Zinyi Lim, who is the director of agriculture and special programs at Pinduoduo, the second largest e-commerce firm in China. She says, how does the transaction log take into account the wastage and spoilage, food loss along the way? So unlike money, where if you are moving $100 from A to B to C and should have 100 all the way, in this case, in a commodity supply chain, there must be a loss which has to be factored in. How do you take that into account? And then finally, before I go to the next set of questions, the final question in this list is from Ashish, who says TOPI is clearly a substitute for certification for exportable, high-value agriculture commodities, coffee, cocoa, beef, all this. Have there been any applications in certification of farm inputs, seed, fertilizers, pesticides? Given the problem of fake, low-quality inputs in many African countries, could this application be used so that it increases agriculture productivity and social welfare significantly? Can you answer these in whichever order you want to answer? Then we'll go to the next set of questions. Go ahead.
Kristen, you can go for adoption and the loss question, and I'll take the premium question.
Of course. So looking at, blockchain adoption, I would say the biggest issue here is how early blockchain was actually recognized and talked about by everyone. It was a technology that was very much talked about before it was ever ready. So I would say those technological issues really have only been solved in maybe the last 4 years, probably more likely the last 3, that the technology was actually ready for adoption. So again, I think we heard about it way sooner than it was actually ready for usage. But really what I think will kind of unlock the adoption issue is really permissionless blockchains and really the ability to actually move funds to these farmers and kind of integrating with their existing kind of mobile money solutions and things like that. I think that makes the value of the technology greater and also the cost slower, because now I don't have 2 systems, now I just have 1 system. So I think really unifying the good side, the supply chain side, with the fund side is probably the most important thing that's going to drive adoption. That's maybe been ready for a year or 2. Then on the issue of kind of these more complicated supply chains that have spoilage, blockchains can really deal with those in 2 ways. One, every time an asset is transformed kind of from one form to another, there's kind of math that can be kind of added in. So we can say that 100 kilos of green coffee is going to become 80 kilos or 85 kilos of roasted coffee. So we have the ability to kind of add in those known losses. But then on the side of the unknown losses is every time there is a transaction, every time, Kim might send me something and maybe she had, 100 units to begin with, but 10 of them spoiled. So she would send 90 to me, and then we have kind of what are called loss addresses or burn addresses along the way, where kind of these spoiled pieces or these lost pieces get funneled off just step by step through the process. Kim?
On the premium side, yes, you are correct. We have actually seen the Traboca coffee example I showed you. They sell at, Chris, what's the premium they sell at right now?
Instead of selling at 7, they're selling at 9, and the farmers on the ground are being paid 90 cents a kilo.
Yes, and so there is definitely a premium on that side, but we kind of see it as two things. There is the efficiency piece, which Chris was just mentioning. If you're able to actually reduce a lot of the internal costs in the supply chain and actually keep the money moving internally in the supply chain and not have it funnel out to certifications, right? So there's an increased efficiency piece that happens that can reduce the cost of the actual supply chain, but at the same time, there is the premium piece where a lot of what we've seen in the diamonds, the coffee, the more higher goods, because you're able to give unique characteristics and actually have a journey and properties uniquely given to that batch or that specific diamond or that specific, piece of good, you are actually able to like tag that characteristic to it, and that's kind of what's being used as well in the premium side, is to really tell the journey and tell the story of that specific product. So that traceability and that transparency into the characteristics allow people to sell these at a premium. So we've seen both from an efficiency cost saving and premium from an increased selling price. I think those were the three.
There was one more. So then on the side of inputs, we actually have 2 projects that we're working on right now. One that's going to start in Nigeria and Tanzania, and one that's starting in Zambia, actually exactly on this issue of measuring and kind of getting more verification around farmer inputs, and then actually using a lot more on the kind of the side of the genesis of goods at the farmer level, as opposed to later in the supply chain, to actually drive production-based credit scores for these farmers. So yes, there is blockchain applicability to the input side as well as kind of this more consumer-facing traceability. Absolutely.
And the other side of that, how could this be used from a social welfare significance? So the other side of this too is there's an increase in, sustainable investments and actually making investments and even mandates in making investments into these types of projects. And so one of the things, because you are recording a lot of the essential impact that is happening alongside that's kind of why we say the word impact monetized, is because you're able to not just record the actual behaviors of the goods moving, but also all the claims that you're making, the environmental impact, the actual productivity increases. This allows these investors to also have information, historic information, real-time information, to make better investments or better foundational, grant structures and so forth into these types of projects. So you could have, for instance, literally built a grant into some of these projects where you literally have that if X amount of kilograms of goods are delivered, then only this piece of the grant releases. And that's the beauty of blockchains as well, is that you could set it up so that all the logic pieces, all the trigger pieces of the grants are only released when certain results are reported and recorded in real time. And so that's another side of this, where there can be, funding coming from different sources that move back into the actual source of what's going on, just because they're able to see more information, and we're solving that information asymmetry problem that exists right now.
Thanks a lot. I think this is very good. And I think we'll organize a specific session with the Africa investment managers in our portfolio, so that you can talk about the examples, what you are doing in Africa in more greater detail. When Chris talks about the inputs part and the credit scoring part, these are all of great interest. Developmentally, I think the farmer-facing solutions are of great interest to us, and the market-facing solutions also are of interest to us. So clearly now there's a questions are about your own business model. So Zinni is asking, what's your business model? You charge a maintenance fee or a transaction fee or per account, or how does it work? And then there's another question on basically Ben Rico is asking that to utilize the traceability, there will obviously need to be an application built upon the topol infrastructure. What would be a good price, for that building that cost of development of an entity was to strengthen its supply chain mechanism with your solution. So basically what people are asking, what's your business model? If people want to work with you, how will you work with people? And how will that be financed? It's a simple question. You must be getting asked that many times. So it means people are thinking about you. So give them some sense of how you would work with when you build a solution, and then when you maintain it, and how you help them implement it. What's your business model?
Yeah, so it is exactly, I know someone actually mentioned is, do you charge a small fee per transaction? Is, so blockchains as a whole, they do, Ethereum has gas fees, but they're very volatile with cryptocurrencies. So yes, Topol's blockchain, what we've done is there is a small blockchain transaction when you create the asset, and there's a transaction when you transfer an asset. And as you add more information, there's a new transaction. So there's like a 10 cents transaction if you add information because you're adding to the chain. And then what we've done in this transaction model, this is the beauty of having owned our own blockchain, we are able to create a unit measured, so if you're moving, say, 10,000 kilograms of good, we have these bucket approaches where if you're moving, less than 100, let's say 100 kilograms or less than 1,000 kilograms or less than a million kilograms, you can actually bucket the approaches, and there's a price for transfer of asset and a price for creation of asset. And so that's the actual, but I'm happy to share that with you guys. But how we work with people, we have two approaches. We call it BaaS, blockchain as a service, and BaaS plus. So the BaaS model is very much if you already have a platform and all you really want to do is integrate into the Topol blockchain. There is BaaS offerings. There is actually a hosted node or a hosted service that you can use. And how that works is you just pay a monthly subscription fee, and then you buy transaction bundles, like anyone would, do when you're paying for AWS servers or you're paying for your actual clouded hosting service. It's just bundles of transaction credits. And then for the BaaS Plus model is more we've seen a lot of people come to us and said, we want you to help us build this platform from point A to point Z. We don't have a full ecosystem yet. We would like to go for the next, it's a 1 to 3 year contract. We kind of work together. We build the platform together. We do all the maintenance and hosting. We do all the integration with you and make sure that, it is all the modules that are necessary for your specific application works for your environment, for your area. I always say it's, you want to be able to run your own hotel, but ultimately we have blueprints for these hotels, and then we help you set it up, build it, you contract us to build it, and then you run your hotel and we do the maintenance, hosting, and you just pay us electricity fee to use the blockchain. And that's ultimately the two sides of what we offer. And then the underlying, but paying your utility fee to use the actual blockchain itself.
One thing I do want to jump in with really quickly is I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with the Kobo Toolbox or Kobo Collect, but this is actually one of the things that I'm personally working on integrating with the Topol blockchain right now as kind of a very simple starter way for people who maybe are going to build a full application in the future or have their own application in the future to start using the Topol blockchain more quickly. So that's something that we're working on, and we are very, very excited about that integration that's being worked on now.
Yeah, and now on that note, actually, so when I talk about value-based transaction fee, so just to give you guys an idea, it's between 0.1 and 0.25, one basis point and 25 basis, or 10 basis points and 25 basis points transaction fee on the value moving. So if you're moving, 40 million in value, you can work that out. Yeah, so it is much lower than the current. We actually have a really a document where we went through current certification processes and how much money you could save by just automating the whole process through this. And because you can actually calculate your price in real time, which you can do with the status quo, but at the same time, when you're working with permissionless blockchain, like Ethereum, you also don't have a way to calculate. There's no way to really know what your transaction fee is, because it's not based on the value you're moving or any business operations that you're doing. It's more based on computational complexity. Who owns the information?
So I think, Chris, this is very useful, the Kobo toolbox, because our task team managers in the bank are familiar. They use Kobo toolbox for a lot of internal work. So I think that would be an interesting thing to look where you are building it as you go, and there's a more kind of co-production going on the solution. I think that's a very good idea. I think we will engage with you with some teams on that at some stage. If we can do a good pilot and show and demonstrate with certain teams how this can be done, that would be quite encouraging. There are
Wonderful.
other sets of questions. Yeah, definitely we'll touch with you on this later on, because I think the familiarity with Kobo toolbox in terms of the World Bank staff is very high now. I think during COVID, the utilization of Kobo toolbox has expanded by 5 times during the World Bank, in the World Bank. So that's my data for you. So I think it's a very good opportunity, because people are now familiar with how that tool works. And if we can bring it as a way of developing solutions in X amount of locations, that could be a good way of us getting started on some of these things. So that's it. And now we have last set of questions, and you can sort of answer them in whichever way order. These are more kind of questions about how do we, distribute the cost of transactions throughout the value chain, and who is the owner of the information? Do all actors own the information, but who manages it? So it is like you have answered them in a way. You don't have to answer if you have already answered them. Then the set of questions which Sitaram is asking, because he's using a lot of traceability solutions in all the programs in China. So he's saying, do you have examples where IoT and other kinds of things have been used, sensors have been used along with blockchain to build a lot of credibility? How do we bring different measurement protocols now? Because we are using now increasingly sensors for food quality and food waste. How does that information get integrated into the total system which you are creating there? That's one question. And then people are also asking, does this work only in certain commodities, or in dairy, where if one farmer delivers low quality, everything gets spoiled? So how do you do it in places where there is more spoilage likely to happen? And does it work in dairy? Have you looked at applications in dairy? The third is that, are you looking at more opportunities in organic certification? Does blockchain help us to do the organic certification better and faster? That's another one. And then we have a final question in this round, and then I think you can, I think, have your closing remarks, built in there. I think Gada is asking that food supply chains are increasingly global and elongated. A key for success is interoperability with other systems or ability to exchange information. This could be challenging if each value chain player has its own system. Does this mean that blockchain traceability work only in vertically integrated chains or short value chains? What are the solutions to these challenges? And final question, which is a very important one, since World Bank primarily works with governments, is there a role for public sector? How does public sector help build this ecosystem? And when does private sector take over? Because part of your work is with the companies who already want to make their businesses more ethical and socially responsible. And part of it is we would like to invest in things which are public good things, are farmer facing, and something which Kim was saying, how can our cooperatives become part of this, so that we get a cooperative blockchain gets a score, and then everyone finds the people who get higher scores on these transactions and all, and are found to be more socially responsible, ethical, then get more buyers from the private side of it. So what's the role? How do we, can you take these questions in whatever order you have, and then respond to that? These are specific questions, because people who are dealing with it, I would give you my kind of take on this, is that people have heard a lot of people from different blockchain solutions, but they are yet not to see a solution which works in a way that it would make sense for them, and they see a lot of small pilots going on here and there. So I think if you were trying to explain based on the questions which people have raised, how do you build interoperability? How do you use other things like what we are investing in IoT and other things, So how does this system take into that account, and what is the role of public sector? The World Bank works with millions of farmers across the world, okay? If we were about to do this in 3 countries, 4 countries on an intensive basis, how will you work with us? That's the final question I want to raise. Too many questions, but we have now 10 minutes in which you have to answer all these questions. Okay.
Chris, I think you should take the design questions, all the chief architect questions.
Of course. So in terms of who's paying the fees and then kind of who owns the information, so we've actually really seen it work different ways. We've seen examples where kind of the final trader is the one who kind of sets up the whole system, and they're the one that ultimately kind of pays all of the fees. We're working on projects right now where that is coordinated by kind of an organization, but everyone's still paying their own fees. So we've seen on the fee side both setups. In terms of the information, it's absolutely a true statement that everyone gets to, in a blockchain setup, control their own information. So then there's the control of the information that's always kind of at the individual level or the kind of the individual entity level. And then there's the management of it. So blockchain networks are kind of supported by a kind of decentralized setup of nodes that are all incentivized to kind of keep that data live and to keep everything moving forward. So that's where these transaction fees come in. It's a transaction fee kind of in compensation for maintaining the security and the availability of the data. But these people don't get to control it. They just kind of keep it up and they get paid for that. In terms of kind of these dairy supply chains and things like that, we have not personally kind of engaged on that side, but we have seen definite examples of that. And you do have the ability to kind of trace and say, okay, I know which inputs or kind of which streams came in to kind of the big collective at what times. So I can actually kind of trace what might have caused the spoilage. So you do have that granularity. And then dairy,
sorry, yes,
yes.
continue.
And then dairy is actually kind of a very interesting case because it is one of the areas where we've seen a lot of IoT integration. There's been a lot of interest in cold chains using blockchain technology where you actually have IoT, where you have lots of sensors kind of continuously communicating with the blockchain to say, are we still in the bounds of temperature? Are we still in the bounds of pressure and things like that? So we definitely do see IoT solutions. We see drone solutions that we've engaged with, as Kim said. So yeah, the idea is to kind of build a low-level technology, kind of like at an infrastructure level, and kind of give API access for as many different data sources as possible. Kim, I'll turn the next few over to you.
Yeah. And I actually think that's exactly what I wanted to go to, like, how can we work with the World Bank is that answer. Like, everyone sees all these blockchain solutions. And my second to last slide somewhere, I actually said there's so many blockchain traceability solutions, but they're building on an underlying infrastructure that was not designed or developed for the exact space that we're talking about right now. The infrastructure itself does not have the features and the functionalities to do this integration, to think through, like, what does it look like for all these platforms to talk to each other. At the same time, they're not in the same ecosystem. So when we're talking about Parmesh, about, like, let's try and say we take Kenya, we take South Africa, we want to create an ecosystem, the reality is exactly that. How do you connect these countries? A digital highway system. You have to think about the infrastructure layer. And so if you have these platforms that are actually running, as a collection, you have a city essentially digitally running on the same highway system that the other city is running on, right? So you have these two ecosystems that are talking to each other, but they can also internally, but they could also start talking to each other here. What you can start thinking about, just like you, as we just searched for that specific hash in that specific platform, you can think about this even further. We could create a dashboard for the World Bank where we are literally tracking the SDG of everyone. Like, we're watching their SDG behaviors, right? Because all those ecosystems they can link into, because we have this digital infrastructure that's integrated all of these players, we literally could have an SDG rank on everyone in this ecosystem, because you could see them and they have to report, and it can even be automated because they're using the same digital infrastructure to create like a dashboard of your SDG tracker, your impact mapper, right? Like, how do we actually take that information that's now being collected? You should think about it more like, you know, I always talk about when we, in the financial sector, when we really grew is when Bloomberg existed, right? Like, I'm a quant by training, so that's what my training is. But Bloomberg is our central source of data where we go and we grab a bunch of information and we make investment decisions on. The same thing as this, you could still create the central dashboard for impact and be able to see how do we make sure that private money could come into this, and how can we make sure that institutional investors could invest into this specific ecosystem. At the same time, how can those specific cooperatives get their score up? How can they actually have, like, I think about the SDGs, how can they actually specifically think through their SDG ranking? So yeah, I mean, I think that's the, and Chris, if you want to add something there, I think that's the other side of this is, I think the reason why people are like, there's so many solutions, yes, because there's solutions, but they're not actually blockchain, like the underlying deep infrastructure that should power these solutions. So it's one layer deeper of saying we need to connect all these solutions, not just have all these solutions. Chris, you can add there if you want to finish up.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of on the role of, the public sector and the bank, we've thought about this a lot, and we've always kind of come down to kind of the role of coordination, the role of convening, and then also kind of helping bring the other solutions, the wallets, the communication tools, the data tools, just kind of bringing all the tools that you already work with, bringing the tools that your farmers already work with, and saying, all right, we need this here, we need that there, and all of this is going to integrate together. Because it's a very complex problem. It's kind of lots of moving parts, and there's always that role of saying, how do we set these standards? How do we bring the groups together to set the standards so we can actually all gain more value from systems like this? Because network effects are absolutely kind of something that not only exists in blockchain, but kind of exists in any certification or accreditation setup. So that convening and coordinating role is incredibly central, and I think is always best played by the public sector.
And then at that point, yesterday, our OCC of the US, right, Brian Brooks, who's actually a good friend of Topol, and I can say that publicly, but he used to be the chief legal officer at Coinbase, and we had him come talk in our class last year. They just came out, his office just came out with banks becoming the actual, they can hold the wallet or the actual keys for the farmers, for the individuals. So banks starting to become the on-ramps and off-ramps off of these highway systems is another way where I see that there's going to be a big integration into how do we make sure that we don't lose our private key? How do I make sure that I actually can interact in this highway system, but my password or my key is protected somewhere or is held somewhere? So we've seen the same thing like in the Netherlands. We've seen Rabobank do this, but we've now seen the US kind of come out and say, hey, banks, US, you guys can start doing this and managing people's actual keys for them. And so I think that's where this next generation of key management for the wallet access and things like that is where banks will very much come in too. So there's going to be some interesting progression, and I'm very excited for Brian Brooks being in the position where he is, because he is really moving blockchain and the actual obscurity of cryptocurrencies into action.
Thank you very much, Kim and Chris. It's very, very exciting ideas being discussed, and I think what I would like to say is that I think there's a lot of food for thought there, and there's different ways of thinking about the way we think about value chains, the way we think about how to extract value with farmer organizations and cooperatives. We have thousands of these farmer organizations, so they have got a lot of benefits out of aggregation, but they haven't got enough benefits out of building a track record and then being able to transact with market in a way that they will be able to build on their past track record. So I think we have to find a way of how do we measure that track record, record that track record, and then convert it into benefits, both for the farmers, the cooperatives, and then eventually also for the guys who buy it also. So we have a blockchain lab in the bank which tries a lot of interesting pilots and projects there, and but they have always remained at a very pilot level. I haven't seen anything scaling up yet. So basically, in the agriculture food system, in our new kind of thinking on food system, we are also going to launch an innovation lab now, in which we will take solutions like yours, which have been offered, and then look for countries like cocoa value chain, and where we work with a lot of value chains. But I don't think we have yet to come out with an impact investing mindset on how we work. It's more a mindset about how we can do some input, some activities, some outputs, gain there, but we haven't created an ecosystem that accompanies those investments which we make. So I think the way we will do it, that we'll have a kind of a deep dive session with certain people who manage these investments from the bank side. And then eventually we also have then people from our partners and the clients also side, and then see whether out of that we can build a large proof of concept within the bank programs. Because the bank has a peculiar way of working, has peculiar ways of doing things, and what you do has to now integrate with that. But I would love to see a portal on a particular value chain with our key partner, whether you take cocoa or whatever, which allows to see this farmer data and all this data in a very verifiable manner. And then we are able to, in the impact investing format, see whether if we have invested in quality certification and all, what is the benefit which is accruing to people, and to be able to do it in a very transparent manner, to be able to do that. So we will take this as a candidate for the innovation lab, and but it requires a little bit of a discussion between the people from those country teams which lead those investments. Like we have a lot of teams joining today from all places, so which is good, because they're hearing you, and they are forming their opinion about you and your solution. So I think it's not enough, because we had a lot of things to cover in this topic, and time was not enough. But I really appreciate your openness and your sharing all your ideas and thoughts, both you and Chris. And we feel that we will be able to build on what we discussed today and in future. I also want to thank everyone who is on the other side. I think you also advertise this quite widely, so you have some of your own ecosystem also there. And so I think it's a good turnout. And I think questions, the quality of questions is very good. What we also do is that we curate all the questions which you couldn't answer, and we will throw it back at you. And we then share some kind of a response, which is more, a curated response with everyone, a larger group there, so that people are able to understand these questions, and you can get more time to respond to them in a thought out way there. I also want to thank GI for being a good discussant. GI is, one of the few people in the bank who understands this, and I don't want to share that she's also a closet investor in some of these things. So I think I'm not letting out a secret there. So she understands it better than many bank staff, because she wants to know it for all reasons. But we think the developmental implications are completely not explored. We don't have any scaled up solution in agriculture and food right now. So we would like to be part of creating that scaled up solution, and really looking at an alternate way of how we do these. We do value chain projects like in every country, but we are dissatisfied with what we see as results. And part of it is because we don't record, we don't measure, we haven't created an ecosystem around that. So I think it will be good to take some countries, some value chain, just drill it down and show the proof of concept there. So look forward to this another discussion with you. I think hopefully we'll get to something very concrete at the end of it. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks a lot for attending.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks, Kim. And we will please look for the next announcement. I think it's coming soon on this topic, and it will be most likely Digital Green, who will talk about their farm folk solution. which they are trying to link up a lot of smallholders with markets. And I think, but thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks a lot, Kim.
No, absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Bye bye. Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you, Kim, Chris. Thank you, Parmesh.